So we are very pleased that Cynthia Kennedy from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston is joining us this afternoon to discuss the mental health challenges that often follow a recovery. And as we said earlier, those are challenges for staff, for survivors, and for the wider community. Cynthia is the clinical coordinator at the Center for Violence Prevention and Recovery at Beth Israel Deaconess, where she oversees counseling and support services for those whose lives have been touched by tragedy. So as we said, this will be a little interactive. Cynthia is going to begin first with a few personal reflections on her own experience surrounding the events of the 2013 Boston Marathon. When Cynthia concludes, we're going to have our previous speakers come up to the podium, or come up to the table here, and we will have a discussion based on your questions. So Cynthia, come on up, and we will begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here with all of you and to discuss this very important topic. Our panel is entitled Navigating the Recovery. So we're going to be talking about the far-reaching and painful mental health challenges that impact not only staff, victims, but also the wider community of Boston with regards to the Boston Marathon bombings, as that's the process that I have been navigating together with the patients and clients that we work with at Beth Israel. For many who have been impacted, navigating the recovery feels like being thrown into the wilderness without a compass or being on a journey without GPS. At Beth Israel, our social work staff has been involved at many levels, accompanying people on this journey. From the acute crisis on the day of the tragedy, social workers were deployed to the emergency department as patients and families were brought in, providing emotional support to the injured, information about the location of loved ones to family and friends, and offering strength and encouragement to staff members. In the days, weeks, and months following, social workers conducted facilitated conversations with staff in the emergency departments, the ICUs, the PACUs, and even with non-medical staff who were working in the medical tent on the day of the bombing, thereby providing a needed place to reflect and process their experiences. Social workers also offered ongoing support to injured patients and families over the course of their stay with us in the hospital. We also participated in the multidisciplinary outpatient follow-up clinic that the hospital put together. Instead of having patients go to multiple different appointments, they created a one-stop shop so the providers came to the patient. So surgeons, physicians from the ortho and the plastics and the trauma team, along with social workers, attended follow-up visits with patients and social workers checking in about patient and family members' ongoing coping post-discharge. In addition to the 25 or so injured patients that we cared for, within weeks of the tragedy, my team at the Center for Violence Prevention and Recovery began receiving requests for outpatient therapy and support from race volunteers, spectators, runners, first responders, and residents of Watertown and the communities impacted by the lockdown. To date, the majority of people seeking individual and group therapy with us at Beth Israel following the bombing have been those who are struggling emotionally and psychologically, who witnessed the horrific scenes because of their proximity to one of the bomb blasts, but escaped without physical injuries, or in some cases with minor injuries. This is a group that one of our former support group participants has termed the invisible victims. As she put it, I quote, "I've become a member of a club of invisible victims that I didn't ask to be a part of. Given the high concentration of people near the bomb blasts, the potential members of that club number in the thousands. So some of the challenges and themes we've seen in this work over the past year include difficulty connecting to the needed services. I've heard time and time again from folks saying, if only I had known about your services months ago, or I got sent to 3 or 4 different places before I finally found you. And those are things that we want to avoid. We want to create a seamless process by which people can access mental health services. Folks we work with display a range of post-traumatic stress symptoms, everything from avoidance to hyperarousal to intrusive symptoms, sleep difficulties, anxiety and panic attacks, and difficulties being in crowds that were never an issue before. I'd like to share with you the words of one of our support group members as she reflected in an essay that she wrote. She's talking here about the symptoms that she didn't anticipate to have, and in this case, intrusive memories. She says, "The first time I experienced an intrusive thought, I was standing on the Red Line platform at Park Street Station, awaiting a ride southbound. I turned to watch the train approach from Charles Street. As the first car entered the station, it exploded. The room was filled with smoke and fire and bits of train flying everywhere. The people around me were bleeding and catastrophically injured. I alone stood uninjured and whole. Even as I was watching this all play out in my head, I knew it wasn't really happening. Yet I stood there, frozen to the spot, and unaware of anything that was really happening around me. The experience lasted only a few seconds, and then I came back to reality. Boarded the train and went on my way. That was the first of many intrusive thoughts I experienced in the weeks after April 15th. In addition to post-traumatic reactions, a lot of people talk about their loss of a sense of security and order in the world. So feeling as if the world that they now operate is no longer safe. For many people, they're struggling with survivor's guilt, questioning their own reactions following the bomb blasts that may have involved running towards the injured to help out, or instinctively running away for self-preservation. Many people don't feel they have a right to their reactions. They have no invisible scars by which to justify the pain they're experiencing. Time and time again, I hear people talk about feeling misunderstood by the people closest to them, those to whom they would normally turn to for comfort and care. Oftentimes, people send them subtle messages that they should just move on and forget. However, this leads to people feeling isolated. Again, I want to share from this former group member. She speaks about isolation. The news media and our civic leaders focused attention on the individuals who were physically injured and primarily on those who were catastrophically injured. I understand that, but the lack of attention for those of us with invisible, emotional, and psychological injuries left me feeling isolated. It seemed like the city and society expected all the rest of us who were there that day to be unaffected. But I was affected. So where did that leave me? Another common theme that we see is that this trauma, the trauma of the marathon bombings, often opens up previous traumas that people have experienced in their life. And so that the impact is that much greater because it's compounded. Many people have experienced the loss of their jobs. They have not been able to return to work in the past year, thus creating financial strain and stress for their families. experienced the loss of relationships as they pulled away from those more natural support systems in their life. A reduction in the scope of their life and activities. There's a gentleman that we work with who used to not volunteer, but had a part-time job at the garden, not something that he needed per se for income, but something that he enjoyed doing, being an usher for concerts and for sporting events. And he has not been able to return to that job, because he's concerned that every time he sees a backpack, he'll react in panic. In essence, people feel like a shell of their former self oftentimes and wonder when they will return to normal again. Another challenge that we weathered recently is anniversary reactions. A lot of people experiencing anticipatory anxiety in the lead up to the first anniversary, and a pressure that they put on themselves to heal and have moved on by that 1 year mark. And so for some people, experiencing a lot of disappointment when that has not come to fruition. I want to say just a couple of comments about the trajectory of healing that we think about while working with victims of the marathon bombing. Many people need to hear that the reactions that they're having, that they're experiencing, are normal reactions to a very abnormal event, because it leaves people feeling out of control, and oftentimes they wonder if they're crazy or they're going crazy. So offering a lot of validation that what they're experiencing is indeed a normal reaction. We also work on addressing symptoms and helping people to reduce their symptoms and reduce the impact by learning new coping skills, grounding techniques, and affect regulation. Medication can often be helpful in these cases as well. For some people, especially where sleep, nightmares, and anxiety are interfering with their functioning. We encourage people to have patience with the process, because healing is just that, it's a process. And there is no prescribed time frame. It's very individual for each person. We also encourage people to seek safe supports, so those folks in their life with whom they can be authentic, they can ask for what they need. And that could be trusted friends, it could be seeking out a professional, or it could be peer support. We've really learned that peer support can be an invaluable part of the recovery process. So the chance to connect with others who share that similar experience has been crucial to so many people that we've worked with. We've seen that operating in our support groups. And knowing that there's going to be progress and there's going to be setbacks, that the recovery isn't a slow upward process. People will go forward and move back at times. And people are going to experience other life stressors during that process. So other life marches on and other stressors happen. But oftentimes people feel less equipped to cope with those because their normal coping systems may be overwhelmed. And finally, discovering your new normal. While people really, really, really want to go back to their old self, they have been changed by this experience. And so for each person, they have to discover what it is for them that's their new normal. Since survivors can express the journey more eloquently than I can, I would like to end with 2 poems that another client of ours wrote, and she gave me permission to share these with you. She was in the same group as the other writer of the essay, so you'll hear some common themes here. Here I am in a club that I did not want to join, but they signed me up. A club of invisible beings. You hear sirens, you hear alarms as well as screams. You see mutilated parts, you have intrusive thoughts. Suddenly they hear your pleas and they understand. Someday soon my life will change. I now know that I'm not alone. The help I've had has helped somewhat, though not all is said. You have good days and cherish them, and hope they will last. You find the strength to ask for help, and suddenly they understand. Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'd ask you, Cynthia, if you can have a seat right here. Let's see, where are the names? There you go. You're right here. And for other three panelists, if you can come on up and sit behind your name, that would be terrific. Don't be mixing it up now. So as I said, I appreciate the feedback we received from all of you on some questions. So the part of this conversation is to engage our panelists with some of the questions. Len, you have something you want to say? Go.
There were two things that I was just struck by. One is you used a term, I think you said psychological injury, and I think it's a really powerful term, because what it does is it identifies a real psychological, something, in some ways it legitimizes a mental health concern or a mental health or psychological injury. It becomes as legitimate as a physical injury that somebody can see. There's less chance or less likelihood that people will be seen as lesser or unable or diminished in some way if we can acknowledge that it's actually really an injury. I think that's really important. But the other thing I was thinking about was in the months and the year after the marathon, we've seen a lot of images of triumphant return of the physically injured. We've seen people throwing out the first ball of a baseball game. We've seen people standing on the finish line on prosthetic legs, people who look strong and they're smiling and they're talking about their recovery. And we don't get similar kinds of images or similar kinds of discussion about both the struggle of recovery from psychological injury and maybe the triumphs. They're probably not as easy to identify, not as easy to describe, but I'm struck by that difference. I wonder if you've had some thoughts on that.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think I appreciate your comments. And many of the folks that we work with, have talked about that idea of Boston Strong. And it's been a rally cry for so many in the city, and a needed one. But oftentimes people don't always feel Boston Strong, and so if they don't fit within that category, where does that leave them? And so I think we need to be able to make room for people all across the spectrum. Even the folks who have made very remarkable recoveries and healed dramatically from their physical injuries are also going to experience struggles. And so that's not the entire picture. They'll have good days and bad days, and we need to make room for that. Even though of course we want everyone to do well. That's just kind of our nature, is, hoping that people are going to be able to regain their physical capabilities and return to a better place. But it's important to acknowledge that that's not always the case. And even when people are making progress, they will have some setbacks.
For our other three panelists, here's a question that plays off this, and we can probably just go right down the row, starting with Martina. Question from the audience: how and for how long were mental health recovery needs managed after your disaster?
For me, it's twofold. From Hurricane Sandy first, for my patients, my veterans, there's always mental health recovery. I mean, they are veterans. Many of them are combat veterans. So the concept of mental mental health diagnoses is, if you run VA's numbers in the top 3 DRGs, the top 3 DRGs are all mental health DRGs for VA. It's part of our population, whether it's alcohol or drug abuse, or whether it's psychoses. It's part of my veteran population because they are veterans. So it's really, in VA, you never get away from it. It's core mission for us. So in terms of the disaster put a different twist on it for my veteran population. Some of them, as I mentioned earlier, who had homes, et cetera, no longer had homes. So now they were homeless as well as struggling with their mental health diagnoses. I'm not saying every veteran has it, by no stretch of the imagination do they, but it is a very big part of what we do. Probably the more difficult one to deal with, because it was new to us in VA, was my employees. Employees who not only have been displaced from their jobs because of the hurricane, but oftentimes had a very different family home situation than they had prior to the hurricane. They either didn't have homes anymore or had homes that were ruined and had to be reconstituted, and that would take several months or years to do. And dealing with their issues through our employee assistance program and various agencies that we invited in on site, we were able to reach out to them and offer them services in any way that they needed, either they individually or their families. I mean, we had families who their life savings were now gone because they were using all of that to recover. And those college savings they had for their children were no longer there because they were using it just to put a roof over their heads. And so we had different agencies coming in, helping them get through that and sort through their various issues. So for me, it was twofold. One was for my veteran population, our core mission, and the other, probably more challenging for us, was dealing with employees who had never had to face any kind of crisis like this and the effects it was having on their own mental health and their family's mental health. And as I said, that probably for us was the more challenging part.
We integrated agencies within our emergency operations centers for employees, for workers, as well as strike teams for the public. It's something that was managed definitely during the disaster, shortly after the disaster, in each of those disasters. But eventually, after a few months went by, all of those agencies were no longer out there working. So it's during the disaster, it's immediately after, but after those months pass by, it's limited.
And let's ask you a follow-up question. Should it be limited?
No, it shouldn't. It should remain available. But so something we have, we had Louisiana Spirit that was grant funded. So once those dollars ran out, then that resource was over.
Yeah. Marilyn?
I think in our situation, 3 years later, we still deal with some of the issues as far as the mental health issues, and we have services internal, but also we have services available through our employee assistance program and through other organizations, because sometimes people don't feel comfortable accepting those services internally because they do feel like that it makes them seem weak. One thing that we have tried to stress, I guess I had not been acquainted with the term pay it forward, but we have encouraged our employees. There's no shortage of disasters, so as we prepare for our dedication of our new clinic, we've asked our employees, and as an organization, we're assisting another health center that was destroyed by the recent tornadoes. So we've encouraged our employees. I think the thing that we have to be careful about, as Sundee mentioned earlier, talking about the Category 1 hurricane, sometimes we get caught up in this thing about our storm was bigger than your storm, or, our disaster was bigger than your disaster. And every disaster is different, and it impacts a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to help other people, and a lot of time there's healing in that. Sometimes people are not at a point that they can do that, but that's one thing that we've seen over the last few years, that the people have just welcomed any opportunity that they could reach out, looked for other opportunities that they could be assistance. Now, again, we have to be careful, because in the recent events, as we were discussing our steps to recovery, the FEMA people and others were quick to tell us, well, that was a pilot program. We don't do Operation Clean Sweep anymore. So from these lessons learned, the response is different. So what worked for us may not be the best response to the next disaster. So we have to be willing to not say, well, we did it, and, we're the best. We have to be hungry to look for everything and incorporate that. But there's a lot of healing that comes with being able to reach out people that are in similar situations and to help them.
Marilyn, I also want to ask you just a follow-up question I didn't get a chance to before. You live in probably the most active area for disasters to happen at any moment, and that's tornadoes, right? They're popping out all the time.
Right.
How has your community dealt with the siren that must go off more times than you can count over a summer period? How does that affect the psyche of your community? And what do you see that in terms of the healthcare needs of your community?
Well, it definitely affects it. I don't think our lives will ever be the same. But again, we did not have the type of emergency. We've got the code red weather alerts that everyone has access to now. So I think we're so much more prepared now. There are a lot more sleepless nights because you stay up at night. You don't go to bed when those things are happening. But we have so many more options for shelters and so many more options for notification. So I won't say that it's not very troubling. And, we really start looking at things that one thing that we were discussing at our tables, you have to make those decisions. Is it safer to send people home? If you've got people in your establishment, is it safer to send them home to places that are not safe? If you have people that live in mobile homes, is it safer to send them home, or do you want to shelter everybody in if we have safe rooms and storm and gyms that are equipped to hold our children, where before we would send them home in plenty of time? So it brings on a whole different set of questions, and in the most recent event, I had an employee whose home was totally destroyed in the tornado, and we were in the shelter, and all of a sudden she left, and she had to head home to see about her family, and I didn't think that was the wisest thing for her to do, but it was very obvious that from that entire day, she had been really experiencing her own, set of problems that she had to deal with. So it will never be the same, but I think in a lot of ways we're so much safer in a lot of ways than we were before.
And Cynthia, question for you. How do we practice for mental health support needs? Is there a way we're doing that now?
There's some approaches out there. Psychological first aid is one that I'm trained in and most familiar with. That is for the purpose of acute stabilization in the aftermath of a traumatic event, large-scale traumatic event. And so there are some techniques that are, that it doesn't require a mental health professional, a mental health credential to have, that you can learn, that are very helpful in stabilizing a population in the hours and days following a large-scale event. That's one way to prepare, is to have a team of people who are trained in those kind of acute stabilization techniques. The other way to prepare, I think, is by having, at least here in Massachusetts, it was state and city level coordination in place before you're faced with something like this. So in Boston, it was the Boston Public Health Commission, the mayor's office, the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance, who are working together to create, together with the Red Cross, create a family assistance center. Eventually, the One Fund joined that group to have a joint phone number, 1-800 number, by which anyone who was impacted could call to connect for services. So there were lots of things that were put in place early on, but having that preparation, having those sort of that plan in place ahead of time is always the best way to go.
And Martina, I'm going to give this one to you. Suggestion for how best to avoid burnout for the healthcare worker who's in the middle of the disaster. And I think even as you said earlier, they don't really want to go home, right?
Yeah, no, they don't really want to go home. You've gone into healthcare as your life's passion for a very good reason. You want to help people. And so when disaster strikes, you don't want to suddenly say, sorry, I got to go. They don't. Even though, objectively, if you look at them, you realize that they need a break. They need to go home or just get out of, the eye of the storm, so to speak, and take a rest, have a respite from it all, even if it means you're not leaving the building, but you're getting out of where the real action is. And so one of the things that we're very attuned to in the facilities is looking for that. Especially among the nursing staff, nursing who's used to always covering for each other and handing off, and when one nurse doesn't come in to cover the shift, the other nurse stays, et cetera. But you can only do that for so long because that nurse is going to experience burnout, as you said. And so it's, as supervisors, managers, constantly being on the lookout for, we've got to make sure our people have rest. And importantly, the employees need to know that their families are safe. Because during disaster, they're very concerned about what's going on at home, as Marilyn mentioned. And even though they may be in a safe place, if their family's not in a safe place, they can't do their work, their mind is elsewhere, and they may want to leave their safe place, as Marilyn mentioned. And so it's through your disaster planning, making sure that you have those bases covered. Are employees able to touch home with their families, find out what's going on, and know that they're safe so that they indeed can work and continue to work? And then we as managers need to be on the lookout for those employees who are kind of at their rope's end and either need to go home and say, thanks, you've done for us all that you can, why don't you go home, or just need to be out of it for a few hours before and rest. And so we always provide, we always have a surge unit where employees are able to stay and sleep and get away from it all. So it's really through all of your planning. And I just want to touch upon the mental health aspect of it. In VA, every exercise that we do has a mental health component to it. Whether it's, the mental health patient coming in who's just traumatized by whatever the disaster that's going on in the community, or it could be a scenario where one of our employees just can't take it anymore and is having a mental health impact right then and there. So because of our population of patients, mental health always is a key factor of any disaster that we plan in VA.
And I'm going to keep it with you for one more question from our group here today. Who counsels the caregivers? What kind of program do you have for that?
My mental health professionals, I have full staff of psychiatrists, psychologists, and licensed social workers. They have all gone through very specific training for not only for our patients, but for our employees and for family members as well, whether it's patients' family members or employee family members. Because during a real disaster, all kinds of people may show up at your door. It could be family of employees, it could be family of patients, and they need mental health services as well. So we do have teams of people within mental health who are specifically trained to deal with that. And so one team during a disaster is always readily available, and they will kind of spell each other. And so that's the way we've planned it at VA.
My next question is going to be for Sundee and Marilyn. Let's talk about religion. Let's talk about faith. And what role do you tap into for religious leaders in your communities? Sundee, let's start with you, and then Marilyn, I have a more specific question for you on this topic.
So the first thing I thought about when you asked about religion, for Hurricane Isaac, when the shelter was open, it was very important. So we had a religious leader come in and provide service, but one of the patients wanted to be transported to her church. So those individual needs, so some form of normalcy, we had to have a process to do that. And when she voiced her opinion, her concern, it was at the right time. The mayor was in the shelter, so he arranged transportation for her to meet her specific need. But we think about things like that. We provide it, and then individuals have very specific needs that you may have to tailor to.
But is there any thought of reaching out into the community to connect with churches, synagogues, whatever it may be, since it's all sort of a part of the larger community? Is there any thinking that goes on in your space in that area? It may be no, and that's fine, but it's just interesting. I have to say this in full transparency. I'm a minister's son, so the topic's rather interesting to me.
Oh yeah, it's very important for preparedness. We have very large churches in our area that have, they've developed EOPs, emergency operation plans. So we work with them, and honestly, most of our outreaches are done with that community within churches.
Yeah. And Marilyn, specifically, what I took note of was 4 out of 5 churches in your community were leveled by this. What role did religious leaders play in bringing the community together?
Well, I don't think it was a matter in our community of us reaching out to them. I think they were the ones that were leading the charge in most respects, and they did a great job of establishing their facilities. Actually, we had some space that was next to one of our clinics that was some land that one of the larger churches built 2 buildings. One was kind of their sanctuary, and the other was some Sunday school room space. And they actually, they were able to get 2 buildings up really quickly. And kind of the symbol of the whole disaster, the church was the pile of debris that I showed you that had the car flipped upside down. And the building was destroyed, but there was a stained glass window that was behind the baptistry that did not have a glass broken in it. And they saved it and put it on a frame, and every time we had a community event, that was just kind of the symbol that, that we would rebuild. And they actually donated the land to us where our clinic is, where our new clinic is, because they said it had been a place of spiritual healing, and they wanted to continue to be a place of healing. But everyone came together. It didn't matter the religions. It was just, and they were so involved. They had a major role to play in the long-term community recovery itself. So it was very important in our particular community, and it was a time of a lot of unifying, and they have played a major role. They're the ones that have led the efforts to reach out. They went to Texas after the tornadoes there. They've gone to, they're the first ones. They know what to do. They get those containers together days after the tornado with all their cleaning supplies and the brooms, because they know what to do. So it's very important in the recovery, short term and long term, and it can be a very unifying thing in the community.
And Cynthia, certainly for an academic medical center like the BI, you've got a chaplaincy service that comes into play pretty immediately, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. Yes, our chaplain department was very involved in providing pastoral care, not only to the patients and families, but also to staff. Sometimes staff feel more comfortable reaching out to a chaplain than, seeking out social work services or an EAP. So we've paired with them and provided ongoing pastoral care, and especially around the anniversary and planning. Different departments had the opportunity to plan their own moments of remembering, or and some specifically requested to have one of the chaplains present during those moments. So they have played a key role. And also, when you go through a large-scale disaster, it also brings up for people the questions about, kind of more existential questions about why. Why is this happening? Why did God let this happen? So, those are large, complex questions to grapple with, and our chaplains and pastoral care, are well equipped to have those conversations with people.
All right. I'm going to keep this next question with you, Cynthia. And Martina, I'll ask you this as well. How do you assess if your employees are fit for duty if involved in an emergency?
Well, I think there might be some external signs that people could be displaying, but also I think it involves conversation with the person to be checking in about how they're managing with their own stress level in the circumstance, and do they need to step out of duty for that day or take a break? And I think that's where managers and supervisors who actually know their employees and know their work performance and whether or not they're performing at their level, or whether they're having difficulty concentrating, whether or not they're falling behind on their work. They're showing signs of being more irritable, out of sorts, spacing out, those kind of things. That's what I would think about.
Okay.
I agree with what Cynthia says. However, in the federal government, the term fitness for duty is very, very specific. And so every VA facility has occupational health or employee health staff, MDs, RNs, nurse practitioners. So if a supervisor and manager believes that an employee really isn't fit for duty, and I use that term loosely because it means something to the federal government, if they are a direct care provider, a physician, a nurse, a social worker, psychologist, if they're in that category, then the supervisor can ask employee health to actually do a fitness for duty exam, whether it's a physical or mental health exam. So there is that regulation within the federal government. If you are not a direct care provider, and that would include me, it's quite frankly not as easy in the federal government to ask for a fitness for duty, because why are you questioning the fitness for duty? They will not be interacting with patients. So, what's your issue? So believe it or not, it's actually a lot more difficult to get a fitness for duty for me, and a lot easier to get one who is a direct healthcare provider. So in the federal government, fitness for duty is very specific, and there's chapter and verse on regulations in terms of how to proceed. But ultimately it comes down to what Cynthia said. There may be employees who you don't need to ask for an official fitness for duty test, but rather talking to them and saying, you know what, maybe you want to take a couple of days off, or maybe you want to engage with someone and talk through what's going on, because it can be very uncomfortable for an employee to try to admit that they can't get through it. And as I said, in healthcare, you're committed to that mission, and you don't want to be taken out of it. And sometimes it takes someone else to really to take them aside and say, let's talk about what's going on and how best to proceed for you.
And this is a question for all four of you, so feel free to, anyone can answer this. And again, it's a question from our audience, which is interesting. How and what type of mental health support services did you offer and provide for staff And I guess the question is, Martina, you answered it directly by saying you've got a psychiatric staff available.
Mental health, right.
Mental health staff. What other tools can we use to help? Sundee, you got a thought?
There was one, relaxation. So there was an agency that provided acupuncture for us, and that was a form of relaxation and just getting away from the desk for a few minutes. And that was something that was helpful.
Okay. Cynthia, were you going to say something?
Sure. So within our hospital system, there was a lot put out to the staff, resources made available to them, so they could go to the EAP. They could schedule a conversation with one of our social workers. Psychiatry was also available for staff. There were also the Schwartz rounds were focused on people who were first responders, and so that was another place for people could gather and process their experiences. And like Sundee was saying, there were a lot of offers within the community for free massages, Reiki, different types of holistic care that providers were providing or giving their services pro bono for first responders and staff. So a wide range.
Okay. So again, we have the microphones available. If anyone gets any other thoughts during the conversation, please feel free to step forward. Marilyn, I'm going to throw this one to you. Staffing hotlines, call centers in times of emergency. When you're so understaffed, is it okay to use volunteers? Do we know what the answer to that one? I think in a crisis, you probably do what you have to do.
I think probably in those situations, if you're not dealing with patient-specific information, then it's okay. What we tended to use as far as our employees, we did have the instant. We have a blast text message system that we can get messages out, and then before the blast text, we had the old emergency telephone tree that we could use to activate parts to get the information out, and then from the standpoint of the patients, we use more the website and the Facebook page, and then our calls, our appointment reminder system, so that they could give information when they made the appointment calls. But no one realizes after disaster how much time it takes to deal with all of the reporting requirements, because everyone wants daily reports, sometimes more than that. So I had a call every morning with my HRSA project officer, and many times during the day, someone would want to call, and that was just draining, dealing with all of the reporting that went along with that. But there's still a lot of issues surrounding the use of volunteers. It was not so much a problem for us, just I guess because of the way our disaster happened, but we really did not use a lot in the way of volunteers, especially anything that involved protected health information.
And that was the specific question, too, about privacy, so that's a very, very good caution. Marilyn, I'm going to keep it with you, and a question again from the audience. Now that your new clinic is opening in June, what are you doing to help with the transition back into the new facility? And there are three parts to the question: for staff, for patients, and for the community. So let's start with staff.
Well, our staff has been very involved in the process since the very beginning. We wanted to feel like that we had their input all the way, so we developed committees, and we have they've been involved in every aspect of the planning and the workflow of the clinic, and addressing any concerns that they had regarding the weaknesses that were in place. For instance, in our tornado safe room, we have tables and chairs that are mobile, that can easily be rolled out of the room quickly if we need to vacate that room. We have shelving that we can use for emergency supplies, and there wasn't a need for a lot of emergency supplies as far as water and those kind of things, but we will have stretchers and the little portable stretchers and things like that. So they've been very involved in that process. And then with the patients, we have a tornado link on our website so the patients can keep up with what's going on. We're having a really big event for patients and everyone to dedicate the new clinic. And we were talking about, celebrating the past, not forgetting about the past, but then, moving forward and creating a better future. So we've tried to keep people involved and very involved in the entire process, because you can't, if they're not involved in the planning process, then you can't get that buy-in. So I think that's where we've really, and the patients just feel they've been such a part of it, from the mobile unit to the modular unit, and they're just constantly asking, when's the clinic going to open? When's the clinic going to open? So they're, I think there's been a lot of anticipation and excitement.
Great. Let's see, a few more. This would be for Martina, Sundee, and Marilyn. How much is amateur radio involved in planning and recovery? Martina, anything?
It was involved in a very small part. I can't say that at this point it played a very large part, and I think that's because a lot of, the explosion of social media. There was some amateur radio, and I remember a couple of veterans saying, "Oh yeah, I heard about that through amateur radio, and I talked to so and so." But it was a very small part from my perspective in terms of communication and getting out the word.
Sundee?
Yeah, same here. We have a trained operator, but it's always it's a small part. It's within our plans, but it's just a small part.
I think it was a small part for us too. We have a challenging situation. 3 of our 4 clinics have small independent phone companies, but the local phone company had gotten a large grant for fiber. We have fiber everywhere, which is kind of unusual, but the person that owns that phone company is really big into into radio, so he helped get the message out, I think, more so immediately after. It was probably played a greater role than in the longer process.
Sundee, got a couple of questions for you. One is, use the term, what is a diversified communications network? Can you put a little more meat on that?
Yeah, so some of your providers, I know in Louisiana we have Cox, we have AT&T, so ensuring that you have you can diversify, and we also have Verizon that most of our emergency managers may use, those 3, but ensuring that you can contract to diversify those providers.
Okay. And the other question I have for you is, you and I talked about this a little bit on the language issue around communications, but the question is, what have you done to ensure culturally sensitive, appropriate recovery info for your populations?
So that's a new initiative for us. Our DHH Emergency Operations Center has a multi-year training plan. And for the first time this past year, we've included a cultural sensitivity module or series. And we've invited other organizations, agencies to train with us on that. So that's been a big part of, within the last year, been culturally sensitive. We've worked with Red Cross, Catholic Charities, to train together in that area.
Okay, great. Cynthia, I'm going to give this one to you. Where do we pull resources from inside the state when behavioral health resources are already being taxed?
In reference to the Boston Marathon bombing, the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance already had a network of organizations who provide services to victims throughout the state, and they already had grant contracts with those agencies, and so could request additional services from organizations already doing work with that population, victims of crime or folks who have experienced trauma. So we were one of those agencies that was tapped, and they had administered some emergency funding to some of our organizations, just to increase our capacity. Subsequently, MOVA has applied for an emergency anti-terrorism grant that they were awarded. I think it's an $8.3 million award to expand services. So I would suggest looking within the networks of providers that are already doing trauma-focused work and are already working with victims of crime.
And Martina, I'm going to ask you the question as well. And think about it in New York State. How are you handling this issue that we know behavioral health resources are completely overtapped?
We work very closely with actually New York City, since it has its own Department of Health. And so we have many collaborations with the city in terms of mental health as well as various other. And one of the things that I would suggest to states is, have you thought about having an MOU with VA? So in times of disaster, you can rely on the expertise that VA has. Yes, our population is veterans, but in times of disaster, we can help with anything. And we have a large network of mental health providers in VA that can be utilized in terms of disaster. But in New York City, VA does work closely with the city. And right now, as a matter of fact, we're working with the city on solving homelessness, not just among veterans, but among everyone in New York City. And that comes from VA with Secretary Shinseka's pledge to eliminate homelessness among veterans. But now we've taken it the next step of just eliminating homelessness within New York City. So it's the city and VA partnering its resources to really tackle the homelessness issue. But I know many states and cities don't think about looking to the federal government other than looking for dollars from the federal government. But VA is very much a player in healthcare and has a wealth of resources that others can tap into.
Great. I'm going to keep it with you for two questions, Martina. When staff were assigned to another VA hospital, was there no problem with credentialing because they were all VA hospitals?
The way it works in VA is you're credentialed and privileged at whatever your home facility is. Then we can grant, for example, for me, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens are all under me, so it's all one medical staff. They're all credentialed and privileged to work across those three campuses. Where it became different, and we learned in Irene, is the Bronx. Yes, it's VA, but they are credentialed and privileged on their own. So what they did was they granted emergency privileges, which is what they can do in VA for 45 days. And during that 45-day process, if they knew the provider was going to be there longer than the 45 days, they would put them through the regular credentialing and privileging process, which obviously was a lot easier because we, in New York Harbor, already had all of that provider's paperwork and provided to the Bronx, and they could go through their system. People say, well, why do you do that? Well, when it comes to tort claims, the tort claim is against that specific VA medical center, as opposed to, just VA, and it's that VA medical staff that the tort claim may be against. So each one is credentialed and privileged separately. But I have to say it's a lot easier in VA because we already know the providers. It's just going through the actual process.
Marilyn and Cynthia, I'm going to give you both this question. from your experiences with so many older and disabled individuals living at home, what measures can be taken to prepare people for the aftermath of disasters, and more importantly, help them navigate the maze after a disaster? Marilyn?
That has become a real issue in the latest tornadoes that happened about a month ago. Many of the neighborhoods that were hit were very old neighborhoods that had many elderly patients. And I mentioned to you that we have about 30% of our patients that are older, that are over age 65. And when you have a large disaster that hits a neighborhood of elderly people, many of them are forced into assisted living facilities because they just don't have the insurance, they don't have the energy to rebuild a home. So that's something that we have, that we're dealing with our patients right now. And we have reached out to the VA for those that are veterans, and to and our social workers working with different agencies in the community, because it does present a unique set of challenges if there's family. That's one thing that I think we do well as far as taking care of our people, and usually the families will step up to it, but sometimes it is a matter of reaching out to especially the social workers to see home health. We certainly work closely with our home health agencies, but even with that, there aren't a lot of homemaker services and different types of things. And, if you've lost your home and you're 80-something years old, housing is a real concern. That's one of the biggest challenges we face. There are no apartments. There aren't multi-family homes. Everybody lives in a single-family home, whether it's a mobile home or a traditional structure, but it's certainly a big challenge in our area.
When thinking about the provision of mental health services for folks who, because of physical or psychological disabilities, can't get into your facilities, that's something that we have been thinking about in the aftermath of the bombing, and also the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance has been thinking about. And part of that $8.3 million grant, a portion of that is going to in-home therapeutic services, so mental health services that can be delivered at home. So they are currently just making decisions about who's going to be awarded the piece of the pie for those provision of those services. The other thing that we have been looking into, and we actually have the technology for within our system, is video conferencing. And so, like a Skype format, you could communicate with someone, see them on the other side of the video screen in order to do therapy, or we have the capacity to run a group that way, where everyone would be in their home in front of their computer screen and connecting over that medium with a facilitator, a social worker who's facilitating the running of that group, just as you would with an in-person group. So I think technology, we can utilize technology to expand our reach.
My apologies for not seeing you there. Please, your question.
My name is Maureen Suchensky. I'm from UMass Disaster Medicine. And my question's for Cynthia and Martina, and specifically with regards to hospital personnel during disasters and the strategies that you've used to allow your staff to stay fit and mentally well. And did you utilize any of those alternative methods that you talked about, like Reiki and massage, in the acute phase? Were you able to utilize any of those, or any pet therapy, or any other sorts of techniques or strategies that you've developed to help your staff?
I'll start. Yes, during the acute phase, actually, I had employees come forward, volunteer. It's amazing all of the expertise that employees have. So they actually came forward and volunteered to run Tai Chi groups, yoga groups, all kinds of, you name it. We have people talented and able to run them. And they came forward and said, they were willing to do it not only for my patient population, but also for my employee population. So we would have different groups set aside, some for patients, some for employees. Employees could just voluntarily go. No one was forced to go and, let their hair down, so to speak. But be amazed how many people voluntarily went. They needed that break. Sometimes they just needed that camaraderie in a non-healthcare setting. So they could go and, spend 45 minutes doing yoga or Tai Chi or whatever their choice was. And so we also had a lot of small events within the facility so that employees could come together and share their experiences. They needed to just talk to their fellow employees about what they were going through, and at times they were in tears, but I think that really did help them, that they could get it out, and someone who understood what they were going through could listen to them. And many of them were coming to work, as I had mentioned earlier, because it was the one routine they had that was the same for them. And when they would go home, it was a whole different set of circumstances. It wasn't life as normal. And I think being at work, they could literally let their hair down and let the tears flow, because when they were going home, they were being strong for their spouse or for their children or for their elderly parents who are now, living with them all together in a hotel. So workplace became a whole different place for employees because of the disaster, and we were attuned to that pretty early on, and then asked for suggestions from employees. What do you want us to be able to offer to you? We didn't make the assumption that we knew what was best for them, but rather tell us the kinds of things that you want us to know. And as a federal agency, FEMA is not one that comes to us. I know that sounds crazy, but in the federal government, each federal agency has its own set of resources and is reliant on its own set of resources. But my employees needed FEMA because that was how they could get funding for their house or for whatever it was. So we invited FEMA, and they readily came to the workplace. We had, various workshops with FEMA there and with various other agencies coming forward to help the employees. And that's the support that they needed from us, so that not only could they continue to do their job at the facility, but more importantly, that they could provide the support they needed to give to their family.
We did a variety of things. One, as I mentioned in the beginning, was facilitate conversations for different units in the hospital that were, primarily affected by the care of our injured patients. And so, again, like Martina's saying, that opportunity to talk about the stress, the strain, what's going on for staff, people, and to break down and cry and it be okay in a safe space. We also, for social work staff, so it's like, the social workers are kind of the front line that are caring for the rest of the staff, but we also put in place, care for the caregivers. So we have an agency that's very similar to our CVPR team at Cambridge Hospital, and one of their senior staff came over who had a little bit more distance from the actual event, and she did a debrief with a facilitated conversation with those of us who were assisting other staff members. You asked about some of the other massage and therapy dogs and things like that. We didn't do that in the acute crisis in those first days and weeks. However, around the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary, we did put that in place. So chair massages were made available to anyone in the social work department who wanted them. There were opportunities for meditation. We have a Buddhist chaplain who leads lots of meditation groups in our hospital. So that was made available for staff. Lunchtime walks that were coordinated by our group, those were also made available. So there were lots of opportunities for self-care around the anniversary.
I just want to add one thing. As a disaster goes on, many of us are thinking about the aftermath of the disaster and the effect that the disaster has on the employees. But don't lose sight of the fact that life goes on. And by that, I'll give you just one example. I have a nurse manager from Manhattan who's a very upbeat, optimistic person. So when she was relocated to Brooklyn, she was one of the people who really brought the outpatient clinics together and really built a team in the outpatient clinics. I was walking down there it was shortly before Christmas, and I passed her office, and I said hello, whatever, and she just kind of, hi. It wasn't her. It wasn't the upbeat Miss Optimist that I always knew. So I said to her, is there something wrong? And she said, I just hung up the phone with my doctor, and I've been told I have stage 3 breast cancer. So it's not just always about what's going on in a disaster. Life really does go on, and things happen to them that had nothing to do with a disaster. But they're living through, as they're living through the disaster and its aftermath. So don't forget that there are things constantly going on in your employees' lives that you can't control no matter what you do, because it's just the way life is. But they still need you there for that support for them. Because what I have found, if you're supportive for them throughout, they're there for you when you need them for disasters. They don't forget that. So they're all human beings, and I just want to underscore, when a disaster is going on, don't get so caught up in the disaster that you forget other things are happening as well.
On that note, I think we'll close. Thanks for those words. To Martina, to Sundee, to Marilyn, and to Cynthia, thank you all for your time and what you shared with us today. A round of applause.